Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Prime and Load. This is the first of a mini-series that we're looking to do to cover the 280th anniversaries of the Jacobite Rising of 1745. We've talked about it a few times in some of the Q&A episodes, and when we looked at the Irish Brigades, which is an aspect that I've written on, and indeed I've also written on the British Army, the government forces in the Rising. But to cover the story as a whole and the Jacobite army and Bonnie Prince Charlie in particular, we're joined by a guest for this episode, Dr. Arran Johnston. I should also explain as well, we're sadly without Dr. Alex Burns, who has been called away on university business at short notice. So there's Lee here with me, and then Arran joining us as the.
We're still meeting our doctor quota, though, of at least
absolutely,
two.
Yes. We swapped one doctor for another, so yes, doctors are still well represented. Arran, goodness, how long have I known Arran? 20 years probably by now. It's frightening.
Yeah.
Originally through the mutual reenactment of the 45 in this country, which Arran's been a leading light in for as long as I've known him, and indeed for many years personally portrayed the leading light, the Prince himself, in a brilliant first-person portrayal, which he's now alas been compelled to hand over to a younger successor, a young pretender. Although I'm sure he's still a significant figure in the Jacobite high command. But when he's not doing that, he's also a multi-published author. He's written on the Battle of Preston Pans. He's written on the Prince himself as a military commander. He's the Scottish Battlefield Trust president, director, Grand Supremo.
Director, yeah.
Director of the Battlefield Trust, the leading light again in the Battle of Preston Pans Museum that he joins us from today for this recording. So hopefully with those credentials, he's just the man to take us through the story of the 45. And we're going to cover that in a series of 5 episodes to come out on the anniversaries of key dates, beginning with this one, which is airing on the anniversary of the raising of the Jacobite standard at Glenfinnan that kicked the whole thing off in earnest. And really the purpose of this opening episode is to go back and look at everything that happened to get us to that point. And then in subsequent episodes, we'll look at the key events of the Rising itself. So I suppose from the very beginning, and bearing in mind we have an audience who will range from experts to people who've maybe seen an episode of Outlander and know no more than that. I guess the first thing, Arran, if you could tell us the origins of the Jacobites, who the Jacobites were, what did they want, and what were the goals of Jacobitism as we head into the Rising.
Well, as you'd expect, that sounds like it ought to be a straightforward question with a straightforward answer, but it isn't. What a Jacobite is does change over the course of what is a protracted series of conflicts that lead up to 1745. 1745 is the last Jacobite Rising, so it's the end of a much longer, complex story. The roots are essentially dynastic. A Jacobite, in its most simple definition, is a supporter of James Stuart. So Jacobus from the Latin for James. So that's referring to either, depending on what year you're in, King James II of England and 7th of Scotland, or to the would-be King James VIII of Scotland and 3rd of England. So that's what the term means. It's a follower of the House of Stuart and its male line of succession, essentially. So the roots of the conflict, in its simplest form, go back to the Williamite Revolution in 1688, when James II of England, James VII of Scotland, is exiled out of Britain and replaced by his daughter and her husband, William and Mary. The root cause of that is, on the surface, James's Catholicism. He's the anomaly in that he's a Catholic king of Protestant kingdoms. He's head of the Church of England, which is an unusual post to hold as a Catholic. But of course, there are deeper problems behind that as well. It comes down to conflicts over the relationship between king and parliament. And of course, the roots for that go back a generation even before 1688. So these are some of these problems that are being fought over in 1745 have roots 100 years before in the conflicts of the Civil War, things that were never fully resolved. But in its essential sense, it's a dynastic dispute. The royal house of Stuart, the male line of which had been exiled from 1688 and was trying to get back.
Wonderful. So you mentioned that this is the last in a series of risings, and I'm sure as the anniversaries come around, we can go back and cover those, even if it is in reverse order, perhaps. But just to contextualise this, because I think some of the precedents that are set and some of the desire not to repeat some of the same mistakes influence the way the 45 plays out. So could you talk us through the earlier Jacobite campaigns and how they really took us to the situation that we get as we're coming into the 1740s?
Yeah, so obviously the revolution itself in 1688 is hardly bloodless. It sometimes gets talked about as if it is, especially if you're looking at things from an Anglo-centric point of view. But certainly this side of the border and across the Irish Sea, the events of 1688 constitute, of course, the beginning of the First Jacobite War. In Scotland, that conflict is relatively short-lived. We get the battles of Killiecrankie and Dunkeld as the supporters of King James try to resist the imposition, as they see it, of King William and Mary. And of course, a much longer conflict that erupts in Ireland, where parts of James's army, large parts of James's army, remain loyal to him, and a long, protracted conflict there, which I know you've touched on previously. So that's the first conflict. The next flashpoint really comes as a result of the fact that William and Mary and their successor Anne, Mary's sister, do not have their own lines of succession, and so by the time Anne dies in 1714. There is a male line of succession sitting in exile waiting to take over. That's the son of the old King James, James Francis Stuart, often referred to as the Old Pretender. And James had hoped, perhaps a little naively, but not without some justification, that at the death of his half-sister Anne, he would succeed to the throne, there being no other immediate viable candidates. He'd underestimated Parliament's preparedness to rake through the old family tree as far back as it could in order to find a suitable Protestant successor that looked more amenable, that hadn't spent so much time in the French court, learning how to do monarchy the French way. So there was in 1715, after the death of Anne the previous year and her succession by George of Hanover, there was an attempt to restore the Stuarts in 1715 that had quite a broad base of support in parts of Scotland and the north of England. It almost started accidentally, though. James wasn't himself, although he was looking for the opportunities. He assumed that he would be the trigger for a rising by coming over the sea, perhaps with French support. Instead, things were started off by the Earl of Mar, up at Braemar, who had, if you put it simply, he'd tried to get himself a good position in the new regime, had been rebuffed, and so decided he was absolutely a Jacobite instead. So a rising kicks off in 1715. That rising in 1715 caused the government a lot of problems. There was major engagement at Sheriff Muir, indecisive engagement in November 1715. A mixed English and Scottish force is defeated in the north of England, at Preston, pretty much on the same day, in fact. And most of all that has happened before James himself actually sets foot in Scotland. So it's a Jacobite rising that is not driven by the Jacobite king himself. And after a brief showing in Scotland, James realises the military situation is dire and returns to the continent. There's another effort a few years later in 1719, which attempts to exploit international tensions and particularly looks for Spanish support for the Jacobites. There is, of course, a set of European Catholic monarchs who are quite happy to use this Jacobite threat to the Georgian government in Britain. And so Spanish troops land in Scotland in 1719, which is an unusual event. Not a lot of them, certainly not enough of them. It's an unusually hot summer. We had a strange example of, I think maybe unique in Scottish military history, of a Spanish soldier dying from the heat in the Western Highlands of Scotland. But that enterprise is defeated at the Battle of Glenshiel up in the Western Highlands and never really develops into much of a challenge. So things then calm down a little bit in the sense that James has to look to his dynastic security in terms of building a family and his diplomatic links and waiting for another favourable opportunity. The year after his attempt in 1719 is the birth of his son, Charles Edward, and very much then the focus is on preparing the next generation of Jacobites for the next opportunity that comes.
I'm sorry, I do have a question. I don't want to get us too far off the track here, but we've talked about in other episodes entire major conflicts in Europe being fought over successions to the throne. In Spain and Austria, why is this not expanding into a larger conflict like that? I mean, we talked a little bit about the Spanish landing some troops in Scotland, but why is this not turning into another Austrian succession, Spanish succession kind of conflict?
Well, of course, all these Jacobite attempts are being played out against the backdrop of other conflicts happening elsewhere. The Jacobites were dealing, especially if they're looking to support, for example, in Scotland, where in terms of numbers and in terms of bases of popular support, it's very difficult for the Jacobites once they're in exile to be able to reliably assess that military capacity that they still have. So they are reliant on support from overseas courts. And that means they are, to an extent, the timetable for the Jacobite risings is determined either by moments of succession in the reigning British monarchy, like in 1714-15, or by a breakdown in relations or ongoing conflicts in Europe. And as time goes on, of course, the Jacobite court in exile feels certainly more and more dependent on international events in order to find its opportunity. But that leaves them exposed, obviously, to being picked up and dropped whenever the situation seems favourable or unfavourable to them. There's another issue that we should touch on, that during the course of that long process leading up to 1745, there's been a lot of displacement of Jacobites, sympathisers from Ireland, England and Scotland, all of whom have been moving into Europe, have been moving into the various European courts. And as time has gone on, they've sort of transitioned from being a body of people waiting for a return to a body of people who are looking for careers and livelihoods and fortunes in Europe. And so there are all sorts of motivations that have to be balanced out as to whether people will actively back something that will risk a new life that they've built, as well as potentially bring the opportunities of a great adventure. So the time is a really important issue here, in that what people are prepared to pick up the sword or the musket for, as the distance from the original cause of the succession crisis continues.
I think it's fair to say as well. I mean, there were French troops on the ground in Ireland during the 1690s, but that never really had the chance to become the War of the British Succession, because it was already part of the 9 Years' War of the League of Augsburg. So yeah, the snappy name had already gone somewhere else, as it were. I think we could certainly see the Jacobite campaigns as a whole as a British Succession complicates it a bit because we get into Scottish and Irish nationalism, but in the simplest of senses, and perhaps this is why the name has never stuck. We could see them collectively as a war for the succession to the three crowns, let's say. Okay, so you've mentioned, Arran, the new great hope for the Stuarts, the Bonnie Prince to be. I know this is somebody that you've made an exhaustive study of, so we're at risk of not spending the entire rest of the episode talking about his character in detail. Can you give us the background, the early life, and perhaps thinking particularly of your recent book, the training or otherwise that he'd been given as a potential leader of a rising, as a political figure, and even the military experience he'd gained prior to going to Scotland.
Yeah, so Charles Edward is born in a pretty unusual context. We're in the aftermath of, as I've said, the 1719 rising that had failed at Glenshiel. James is essentially moved out of his court where he'd grown up in Saint-Germain, just outside Paris, and diplomatic pressures were exerted to keep moving him away from the centre of power and influence. And so he moved to Rome, which is a move that brings them some diplomatic diplomatic problems because the Stuart court is now in a palace that is provided for them by the Pope directly in Rome. And of course, if you're campaigning to be a British monarch in a Protestant country, that is a bit of a PR problem. And James tries to respond to that in a way, although he's a deeply devout Catholic himself. He does make sure that Charles Edward has Protestants in the household as well. There is an attempt, a significant and I think successful one, to create in the Palazzo del Re in Rome a very British feeling court in exile. It is dominated by Scottish, Irish, and a few English exiles in there too. The first language of the household is English. Charles Edward is very much brought up, and there's even references to the fact that Charles Edward and his younger brother, who comes a few years later, Prince Henry, eating roast beef because they are expected one day to be British monarchs, the British royal family in residence back in Britain. So he's in this remarkable cosmopolitan, busy city, but he's also being raised with this expectation that it is going to come onto his shoulders to lead a restoration of the Stuarts. There's also an assumption that's pretty accepted by this point that that's going to have to happen militarily rather than diplomatically. So Charles Edward is a source of great interest to the British government. Of course, there's a lot of interest in keeping an eye on what's happening down there. Who's going to visit, who's seeing them, is the prince in good health? There are rumours initially that he's a sickly child, but actually he seems to be growing up to be quite strapping and quite good looking and quite athletic, all of which is grave concern to George I and subsequently George II. But the problem that Charles Edward has growing up is that although he suspects he's going to have a primarily military mission, a huge amount of diplomatic pressure is put on European courts to make sure he gets no military experience at all. His father, as Charles Edward moves into his teens, obviously understands that it's going to be necessary for him to get some military experience. James himself had been able to do so. But those efforts come to naught, except in 1734. During 1734, there's an opportunity when the Spanish are supporting the claiming of the throne in Naples and Sicily, and Charles Edward is able to, because the British aren't directly involved in that conflict, there's a window in which they're able to insert Charles Edward for a bit of military experience. So he travels down into Naples. He's at this point 13 years old, and he is there to observe, to spend time with soldiers, to hopefully get a sense of military experience. Obviously, there's a limit to what a 13-year-old boy is expected to do, but it's also a public relations mission. There are great efforts to make sure that Charles is seen, that he's visible. This almost has a risk of backfiring because he almost makes himself too popular and at risk of showing up others. But there are great stories that emerge out of this. It's difficult to get down into what really happened in the trenches at Gaeta, how much of it is the propaganda message that's spread out afterwards, stories of how when everybody else evacuates the house because it's under bombardment, Charles Edward calmly collects and packs up his things before leaving, to show that, in the words of the Duke of Berwick, valour does not wait for number of years. He might be young, but he's clearly courageous. There are concerns raised by Charles's tutors that he also likes the company of soldiers. He likes being with soldiers who are also men, of course, who like to drink, and so even at this early age, he's showing that he's not only willing to get stuck in with the troops, but also that he has an attraction to that sort of rough and ready frontline life. That causes his tutors and therefore his father a little bit of concern. So he gets some experience in the lines of a siege. It's a few weeks. He's not directly involved. He's not in a command capacity, of course. He's not fighting, but he is under fire. That is, however, the only military experience that Charles Edward is able to gather before 1745. The rest of his later teens, he starts to become more assertively promoted as the Stuart heir. He goes on a tour of the Italian states, showing himself as precocious, confident, fit, and potentially therefore very dangerous young man, as somebody who is very much being groomed as the embodiment of the new Stuart hopes. Just has to wait now for an opportunity to put all those hopes into action.
Just to follow up from that slightly, I guess because the 45 is, if it's any one person's story, it's Charles's, and I think the decisions he makes drive it to a greater degree than anything else. I mean, again, briefly, because I'm sure we're going to go into the specifics as we go through the episodes, but sort of main strengths and weaknesses of him of his character, of him as a character. How would you assess him in that respect?
Well, he is not an uncontested character historically, as you know. There are 3 or 4 at least different Charles Edwards that you can find, depending on which biography you're reading or which accounts you're reading. That's partly because he gets heavily romanticized, even mythologized, subsequent to 1746. It's also because there was a vested interest on both sides of portraying him in a particular way. The British government had a lot invested in downplaying his capacities, and to an extent, his doting father was also perhaps, as time went on, more inclined to worry about his weaknesses than he was to see the strengths to an extent. What emerges, I think, from any serious study of Charles Edward is a presentation of a young man who clearly has the pressures of a big mission, that he's self-aware. He understands those pressures. He understands what's expected of him. He doesn't see it in a sort of selfish perspective, in that it's all about but personal glory or personal gain. He does buy into this idea that the people can't truly be happy unless the government is legitimate, and the legitimate government of Britain is through the Royal House of Stuart. So he believes in that mission genuinely. He is very good at building relations and rapport with individuals that he likes. He finds it very difficult to assert himself over older men who he sees sometimes as being perhaps more experienced but less instinctive. He's a charismatic young man. He's at a stage of life, he's 24 when he comes to Scotland, where he's obviously still maturing and developing. I know you touched in previous episodes on the fact that the Duke of Cumberland was of a similar age when he took command in Europe. But Charles Edward hasn't had the capacity to learn the regimental basics. He hasn't had the ability to spend a lot of time observing others directly in military roles. So he has to rely on his own instincts, especially in the early stages of the campaign. And they prove to be, I think, relatively sound. What he's not able to do is back them up with experience. So I think he faces the problem that a lot of young men do, in that he thinks he has the instincts that tell him what should be done. He's not got the experience to be able to back that up in the way that he makes his argument. That sometimes leads him to come across as petulant and frustrated. He's also lived in an environment that has been relatively controlled, and then he's thrown into an environment in which he is dealing with people and motivations and situations that he's had nothing to prepare him for. So he's a challenging character to pin down, because his personality is still evolving, he's still maturing, and also because very few people are able to give us an open and honest perception of the guy that they're seeing.
That sounds like a lot for a 24-year-old to grab a hold of.
Yeah, I think it was, and I think sometimes we forget about that in the human side of it, in terms of understanding him as not just as a military commander, but as a young man who's thrown into this, not only with a lot of pressure piling on top of him, but also all of that personal expectation that is built up in him and is represented by him. That is a lot for a young man to handle. Ultimately, in the longer term, certainly in the post-war, post-45 period, he isn't able to handle all of that.
I think it's the burden of royalty, isn't it? I mean, even Cumberland's career, thinking of his 7 Years' War career, and his eventual disgrace comes unstuck when it isn't good enough for Dad's expectations. So, in some respects, they both come to a less than satisfactory end. So we've got the prince, then got the background. As you've already alluded to, it's been a quarter century or so since any serious attempt to restore the Stuarts by force. Again, just briefly to put this into context, what are the state of the Three Kingdoms as we're coming into the period of the 1740s and the war and the rising?
Well, the Hanoverian succession, obviously, we've gone from George I coming in 1714. We've now moved to George II, who, as you've spoken out before, has built a rapport with the army. He was out at Dettingen. So we have now a relatively established dynasty in Britain. And so this is another sort of sense where that pressure is building behind the Stuart. The longer this goes on, the harder it's going to be for them to sustain a third generation of support. So the government is pretty established. Contrary to, I mean, you alluded to Outlander earlier, but contrary to how it's been portrayed sometimes in the popular media, Scotland is not in any way labouring under some sort of military occupation and seething with discontent. It is going through a transition, however, in the period post the union of the parliaments, which took place in 1707 under Queen Anne, and subsequently the evolution of that expansion of Scottish influence in the British state, and therefore also in the British imperial setup as well. So there are transitions happening, social, economic, political. Places like Edinburgh, where, for example, having been the centre of royal government for centuries, has just about started to get used to the idea since 1603 that it maybe isn't going to be the royal centre anymore, but it's still the parliamentary centre and the economic centre. And the legal centre of Scotland. That is now starting to change in the mid-18th century. Whilst Scotland's trade is moving from eastward facing into the Baltic and towards Scandinavia and Russia and Europe, now that it's got access to all of those burgeoning markets over the Atlantic, the money that's coming into Scotland is starting to come into the west coast. Glasgow is developing as a boom town. Edinburgh is struggling to work out, therefore, what its role is if it's neither the economic nor the royal centre. So, so there is this sense that things are evolving, things are changing, but they're not changing in revolutionary ways overnight. This process is ongoing, and as I say, and that goes back to why there's that sense of pressure on James and Charles to try and sustain a sense of relevance. Things are also changing in the context specifically of the Scottish Highlands, where the nature of clans and chieftainship is starting to evolve as well. There are discussions over, for example, clans that traditionally were where the chief would be able to call out men as part of their sort of feudal obligation, essentially, are now looking more to a sort of landlord-tenant relationship with their people, which might bring greater economic benefits, but weaken their capacity to be military warlords in their own territory. And the Stuarts had a vested interest in trying to keep the clans able to sustain that military manpower. The Stuarts are not in isolation. They are talking to people in Britain and communicating with them on a regular basis and trying to prevent those processes happening too quickly before they're irreversible. It's also worth noting that the Stuart manifesto is evolving over these years as well. They're not trying to set the clock back to 1688, except in the sense of who's sitting on the throne. The Stuarts are aware of the changes and the evolutions. It becomes very complicated for them because they don't really want to run on a manifesto of Scottish independence any more than they want to run on a manifesto of Catholic restoration, because they know that there isn't the breadth of support that they're looking for. They are looking for a Three Kingdoms restoration, and so they're not coming on a platform of we'll take Scotland, we'll restore Scotland's independence, we will rule happily in Scotland, and George of Hanover can sit in London, no problem. That's the Stuarts are trying to maintain themselves as a relevant, forward-thinking political force that will sit into the context of that evolving Britain, not in some way try and set it back to the 17th century. It's easier said than done, of course, and it's a relatively easy propaganda propaganda task to ignore all of that and say these guys want to turn the clock back. They want to go back to the days of the divine right of kings, centralized monarchy, and everything that you as a yeoman farmer or as a mercantile middle-class English trader might have gained over the last 2 generations is all going to be thrown away. So all those tensions are there, those evolutions are there, but the Stuarts aren't alien to that. They're trying to sit within it.
I suppose it begs the question then, doesn't it, though? I mean, certainly from the point of view of somebody listening to this without much knowledge of the period, why would anybody still be a Jacobite at this point? I mean, you alluded with Mar that he hadn't really made it under the new regime, so actually bringing back the old one was a better way to boost his fortunes. I mean, equally, the popular idea is perhaps loyal adherents of the Stuarts waiting patiently for the sign to rise. I'm guessing the truth is going to fall somewhere between those two stools. But how extensive is Jacobite sympathy and support? Well, are sympathy and support the same thing, I suppose? How extensive is either? And who perhaps are some of the leading sympathetic figures on the British side of the water?
Yeah, so I mean, this is a question that hasn't yet been satisfactorily answered to everybody's consensus. The key point you make there is the difference between sympathy and support. Where is the bar at which you are prepared to take your sympathy and pick up a sword to defend it, or not even to defend it, but to proactively go out there and assert it? And that bar is set at different heights for different people. And it's different in the Three Kingdoms. It's different in the Highlands of Scotland to parts of the Lowlands. An English Jacobite, and there are plenty of them in 1745, even if they don't turn out for Charles Edward in the great numbers that he'd hoped, their interpretations of Jacobitism are more rooted in sort of old rural Toryism, and whereas in Scotland there is still an important thread that is just the dynastic loyalty to the House of Stuart that has been the legitimate rulers of Scotland for centuries previous to their exile. But also a sense that in the current situation, in the middle of the 18th century, Scotland's place in the Union is uncertain, although some people are profiting from it and certainly active in it. To what extent do they feel that the dynasty of George of Hanover is actively invested in the lives of people in the north of Scotland? Now, there's differences, of course, between perceptions and realities, but there was a broad sweep. What this isn't is a purely nationalistic movement. It isn't a purely religious movement. Charles Edward and his father might be Catholic, but the vast majority of the people who support him are not. For a start, simply because there isn't the base of a Catholic population in Scotland big enough to have supported them. So it has to be more than that. A lot of it is bound up in a sense of identity and how the Stuarts and Scotland are bound together, and how Scotland is bound into that British package. Sometimes, though, the motivations are very personal. Sometimes they are inherited loyalties. Lots of Jacobites who come out in 1745 have been out previously, or are the sons of men who have been out previously. So the short answer is, if there is one, is that there's no one simple explanation, but the thread that binds all Jacobites together is that they believe the kingdoms will be better run, or that their lives will be better if the Royal House of Stuart is in control. And so there's a sort of mess there of old dynastic loyalty, political expedience, and of course also those elements of self-interest too.
Okay, so we've got the domestic context. We've got Charles waiting in exile. I know we're getting onto something that I've worked on, and I'm happy to chip in a minute on some of the French context that's involved in this. But could you perhaps take us through the development of the circumstances that make the rising a realistic possibility, or a resurgence of Jacobitism a realistic possibility as we head into the 1740s?
Hey everyone, Lee here for the Prime and Load team. You know, we're passionate about exploring 18th century history and tactics and bringing those stories to you. But we need your help to grow our ranks. Please share this episode with a fellow history buff, leave a review where you can, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Most of all, join our email list. It gets you updates and insights into what's coming. You can join by using the link in this episode's description below. Thanks for listening, and now let's get back to the episode.
Well, if we come in sort of 1743, in the aftermath of the French defeat at Dettingen, the ongoing conflict in Europe, the French, or at least some elements in the French court, see that this is potentially an opportunity to bring the Stuart card back into play. The French had, certainly Louis XIV, sponsored James's father and James himself. There was a loyalty that you might expect from one Catholic king to another, but we were a generation on from that, and now it was about political expediency, really. Here was a diplomatic card and a military card that they were potentially able to play. So that what emerges is the plan for the Jacobites to provide the pretext for a military intervention into Britain, led by the French. And James, acknowledging that he is getting on a little bit and his sort of adventurous military days are behind him, sends Charles Edward in response to the call. So Charles Edward travels up to Paris in the expectation that he will be a figurehead for a French military expedition to Britain.
And I'm sorry, if I can just jump in. When he goes to campaign for this expedition, coming from this side of the water, we know obviously Americans do this same sort of thing in support of their revolution. Are there some similarities in kind of what he's trying to garner from the King of France at this time?
Well, he's invited. This isn't Charles Edward turning up and knocking on the door and hoping that this is a good opportunity. There is the door is opened by the French, and Charles Edward steps into it.
It's rather more than, I suppose, the American request. In as much it's not we're having a rebellion, we're having a revolution. Can you support it? It's really can you help us kickstart the process? And certainly the original French planning is. In essence, they're looking for an excuse to invade England, and this is a brilliant way to go about it and potentially ensure that there's some, I suppose, what in the 20th century sense we'd term the fifth column, people sympathetic to the a French invasion is likely to unite Britons against it. A French invasion with a Jacobite figurehead is going to sow discord and make the whole task an awful lot easier. I mean, I think Arran's hit the nail on the head when he talks about expediency. There were multiple factions in the French court. There was some genuine sympathy. I mean, Cardinal Tencin, who was a leading light, as you would perhaps imagine as a prince of the church, was quite keen on a Stuart restoration, a Catholic restoration on religious grounds. Louis XV, when he was thinking his sins might have caught up with him, could be persuaded on a similar basis. I mean, if ever there was a king that did sins of the flesh, it was Louis XV. So yeah, he has a nasty brush with illness in 45 that perhaps suggests to him that doing a good deed for his faith might be a way to smooth over his indiscretions, and his mistresses get sent away at the same time. So this is a level of cynicism that we're playing with. But I think that there's also a party in the French court that really thinks this is a terrible idea. It's going to embroil France in a wider war. We're at a point where the Anglo-Spanish colonial war, the Austrian succession crisis, the Silesian crisis are all merging into one big war, and France is drifting into it without a brilliant idea of why, really, or what they want to get out of it. So you've got a pro-party, you've got an anti-party, and you've got to sit on the French pragmatist party who will throw their weight in council behind whichever side seems most advantageous to France. So yeah, absolutely, when an invasion scheme can be got up, then that's great, and having the Jacobites on board makes it all the better. The two difficulties with that scheme sadly come down to the weather in the English Channel and the Royal Navy, which between them pretty much scupper the entire thing. Although, say, attempting to mount a seaborne invasion across the English Channel and the North Sea in winter is perhaps not the smartest move in the French military naval playbook with that one. So yeah,
no, and of course, the telling moment is that when that expedition hits the rocks, as it were, the French essentially drop Charles Edward and leave him stranded up on the north coast. As if, well, actually, we're moving on now. The situation has changed. That plan has misfired in early 1744. They're not in a rush to bring a similar project back to the table very quickly. And then, of course, as we go into 1745, as you've covered previously, in the run-up to Fontenoy, the situation starts to change, and the investment of French resources is unlikely to be allocated to a very risky and expensive, potentially, operation in Britain, because it's not as necessary to the French. It's still necessary for Charles Edward, who's still sat around Paris wondering quite what to do with himself, having made a vow not to return to Rome unless he's successful in his operation, in a sort of typically Charles Edward flamboyant way, promised I'll return with 3 crowns or in a coffin. And so he doesn't feel, after having been unleashed, if you like, and sent away from Dad for his great opportunity, very disappointed to discover that the French can move on from their proactive support so quickly. And that's, of course, the context into which Charles Edward starts looking for, well, what might I be able to do on my own? And of course, he's now in northern France, where there is a network of Scots and Irish, exiles, especially Irish, who he can start talking to and liaising with. And if left unsupervised for too long, Charles Edward is going to come up with his own version of a plan.
So I'm sorry, I'm going to, if I can recap a little bit just for myself, because I know we were saying before, I'm taking the role as the ignorant American here. So we've got Charles Edward, who has been invited to come in by the King of France to be part of this additional military operation in this larger war that's happening in Europe. France thinks they have an opportunity to strike at England. That doesn't really pan out the way they want it to. So now Charles is kind of seeking his own answer, almost vigilanting, finding his own solution to the problem he faces. Is that kind of a decent summarization of where we're at so far?
Yeah, I think so. And he's now keyed up, if you like. He's now persuaded that this is his moment, this is his window of opportunity, and he's very reluctant to let that slip away from him. He's also now in Paris, which means he's much closer to where decisions are being made that he can potentially exploit, and he's got access to people that he didn't have access to in Rome, and he's away from his father and his father's court, which is fairly conservative, I think it's fair to say, in terms of its approach to a new rising. And Charles Edward meets in Paris, for example, with people like John Murray of Broughton, who's another fairly young Jacobite sympathiser from lowland Scotland, and starts having conversations with the networks in and around Paris, thinking, well, okay, well, what is the potential level of support in Scotland? What might rise if I turned up? And the advice is pretty consistent. I mean, John Murray of Broughton, who, for reasons I'm sure we'll come back to in future discussions, gets a bad press. But he told Charles Edward in Paris that, you'd maybe get 9,000 or 10,000 men in arms in Scotland if you came, but if you come with French support. And now Charles Edward does get those 9,000 or 10,000 men eventually, but he doesn't have the French support at the start in terms of actual boots on the ground. So it's, he's, as you say, he's now keyed up, but the formal planning that had been done initially by the French is now no longer available to him. So he has to either go back to Rome, find a meaningful role for himself in Paris, or take the bull by the horns and see what he can make of the opportunity himself.
I think the thing to add, though, as well, from the French point of view, they've dropped the grand invasion plan. They're now interested in the campaign that's kicking off under de Saxe, and we've already had Fontenoy. But it would be a great advantage to that campaign if the British army had to go home and sort out a rebellion. So, in a sense, the Jacobites are almost useful tools now to the French, that they can give them just enough help to get going, just enough rope to hang themselves. It doesn't have to be a big investment. Plausible deniability. Nothing is official from the French state. It's all through these shadowy intermediaries and privateers and merchant houses and bankers and the rest of it. But it's absolutely in the French interest still if it kicks off, because it will, if not take Britain out of the war completely, it will drastically distract the attentions of the British state for as long as there's an armed rebellion in Scotland or wherever else in the British Isles. And yeah, that's absolutely to the French interest, and they. It's probably fair to say they take advantage of the situation. I don't know, Aaron, if you consider it that way, but that's always been my take, that it's now a useful opportunity rather than a serious attempt to support the rising, at least to begin with.
And ostensibly, Charles Edward does make considerable efforts at secrecy. He's moving around incognito. Is trying to make his plans through a very small network of people. He certainly doesn't tell his father that he's planning to go solo. But I do suspect that there are blind eyes being turned at various points, because there's an awful lot of what must have been suspicious activity happening in Brittany in the spring of 1745. And Charles Edward was, not a low-key character. He was a high-profile person. And there was a lot of interest in what he was up to. And no matter how hard he was trying, I suspect there were people who knew, even if it was on a surface level, that knew something was afoot. And as Andrew says, there is a vested interest in saying, well, as you say, plausible deniability. We're not doing it, but we're not stopping it happening either.
So we have Charles now on the French coast, kind of gathering resources. He does eventually make it to Scotland, but how are we getting from A to B?
So Charles uses the Irish networks, especially around Nantes and Saint-Nazaire in Brittany. Especially useful is Antoine Walsh, whose family had been involved in getting Charles's grandfather out of Ireland during the First Jacobite War. So committed Franco-Irish families. Sympathetic, well-connected. And Charles Edward essentially secures the use of two ships. One is a warship, the Elizabeth, and the other is Antoine Walsh's little privateer, the Dutaille. And with a small household, a staff, if you like, of Scottish, English, and Irish exiles and advisors, they set off out of Saint-Nazaire, link up with the Elizabeth off Belle-Isle, and then head to Western Scotland. Western Scotland is their objective because it's potentially isolated. It's the sort of place where you could stir up some trouble without the government being able to respond especially quickly. It's also, of course, in the heartlands of what Charles Edward has long since been told to expect is a core area of not only support, but support that is able to raise itself militarily into an army very quickly, because the chieftains can mobilize their manpower. So if there's a place where you're likely to be able to quickly gather an army without the government being able to fall on you immediately, the Western Highlands is as good a place as any. So that's the target. There's been very little forewarning, however, sent to those potential Jacobite sympathisers in Scotland, inevitably with a secret operation, or at least an ostensibly secret operation. You can't tell everyone in advance when it's going to happen or where it's going to come. So that is both an advantage, but it's also, of course, a challenge, because it means that nobody's expecting you, nobody is ready. Charles Edward does therefore need to take some military supplies with him, some cash with him. But the one thing that he's short of is to take with him is the men. They then hit a snag almost immediately, to just a couple of days after the two vessels have slipped off the French coast, because they run into HMS Lion, which has no idea that Charles Edward's aboard the little ship that he encounters, of course, but immediately engages the Elizabeth, and there's a 4 or 5 hour close naval action, and the Elizabeth is obliged to return to France. Fortunately for Charles Edward, the Lion is also obliged to sail off as well, having been both ships pretty badly battered, and the crews pretty heavy casualties. And this is sort of the second time, really, where there's the test for Charles Edward. First time after the cancellation of the French invasion plans, and now again at this point, where it might have seemed like the clues in the sky were telling you not to keep pushing, and you might well have thought, okay, this operation is misfiring too. But he doesn't. He presses on, and the single ship, with its very limited amounts of material for war and its very limited number of, it's a very small army that is now travelling to Scotland. It, on paper, should not be striking fear into the British government, and it's with that he sails up to the Western Highlands of Scotland and lands there on the 25th of July.
So just to take us up to today's anniversary then, Arran, we've got the Prince in Scotland with what's left of his following. What's the initial reception? What are the circumstances? Clearly, we've already given away the fact he ultimately raises his standard at Glenfinnan and calls out the Highlands in arms. But it's maybe a more convoluted process to get from coming ashore in late July to raising a standard in mid-August. You want to take us through the reception and, as you say, a Highland community, a Jacobite community that's not really expecting this bolt from the blue.
So, as you say, it's one thing to get to Scotland. It's quite another to get there with a plan and persuade people that plan is viable. So, the first thing Charles Edward needs is an army, and that's the big thing that he hasn't got. When he first makes landfall in Scotland, he lands on the Isle of Eriskay, and he meets with Alexander MacDonald of Boisdale there. And Boisdale says, well, have you brought a French army? No. Okay. Have you brought lots of equipment and a material and a guarantee that a French army will come and support? No. And Boisdale says, well, then go home. And Charles Edward is, being the excited, dramatic, driven youth that he is, who's also got good political instincts sometimes as well as military ones. He says, "I have come home," and this is, this is the moment where we start to stray into the sort of romantic mythology of this whole adventure, if you like. But he is clearly disappointed by this initial reception. He sails onto the mainland and stops at Borrowdale. And from there, he has to now be open about the fact that he's here. He has to start trusting in the Jacobite networks that are around him and advertise the fact that he's landed, because he has to summon people to a rendezvous. He initially gets a fairly cold response, but the immediate threat to danger to his person is risen to by the MacDonalds of Clanranald, who gather a force of 100 or so clansmen around Charles Edward so that he's protected. They might not be instinctively keen on his plan, but they certainly don't want him to be captured or killed on their patch. So they start to rally around him. He makes a show of disembarking everything of use from the Doutai and then sending the ship on to make the statement that he's not just here to touch base, he's not just here to dip his toe in the water and see if there's support. He means it. He intends to stay, and he intends to do the job himself. And he gets some who flatly refuse to join. Others, though, famously are persuaded, more or less, either by his arguments or by his character, or simply by the fact that he has come. The famous story is of Cameron of Lochiel, Donald Cameron, one of the most influential chieftains in this part of Scotland, and loyal to the cause right through previous risings, Cameron and his father. And Donald Cameron is pretty clear. Yes, I've kept my clan loyal and ready, but without French support, boots on the ground, this isn't viable. But he says that he owes it to the prince to say that to his face. And so he goes to meet with Charles and comes out of the meeting pretty much committed to supporting the operation. And there's famous stories of Charles Edward saying to those who are doubtful, who come to meet with him, "That's okay, you can read in the newspapers what happens." And this sort of sense that he tugs on the reputations of some of these men. My father had always told me that you were amongst the most loyal, so I'd be very disappointed if you didn't. And that does work with some, but this isn't old wise heads being swept away by the romance of the moment. They are making calculated assessments of what their prospects might be, on the basis that once they get started, hopefully that will draw the French in. There was always the assumption of most of the senior Jacobites that the French would have to come in at some stage, even if they're not there at the beginning. But it's also they're making a calculated assessment of the young man that sat in front of them. And if he is not the sort of person that you can buy into and that you are willing to not only risk your own life and fortune with, but all of your clansmen as well and dependents, that's an important test that Charles Edward meets. So the rendezvous date is set. The place that's chosen is Glenfinnan, the head of Loch Shiel. It's accessible by road and by water. There's a number of glens that sort of, it's a confluence point, really, so it's accessible. It is dangerously close to the British garrison at Fort William, so it is not without risk raising the standard at that location. But as I say, Charles Edwards simply sends the messengers out. He hopes that they are going to respond. He hopes that those who've indicated support will live up to what they've assured him. He has a pretty tense day, though, on the 19th of August, 1745. He's rowed up the loch in little galleys. He gets to the location, and there's a few handfuls of people kicking around. There's not a lot happening. It's a beautiful spot, but he couldn't stand and admire the Harry Potter viaduct as we can. But it's a nice spot to spend an afternoon. But I don't think he was admiring the scenery whilst he was gnawing through his knuckles, hoping that somebody was going to turn up. He's there for hours before eventually the clans start to arrive. It's not really until Donald Cameron arrives himself with the Camerons. A lot of people had been waiting to see which way Cameron would fall. He turns up with over 500 of his Camerons. By the end of that day, Charles Edward probably has over 1,000, perhaps as many as 1,200 men gathered with him at Glenfinnan. There's a ceremony. There is the Stuart Proclamation is read. Charles Edward's Commission of Regency from his father is read. So this is about making the campaign legitimate. He cracks open some brandy. There's great cheering. There's throwing of bonnets into the air. And then the process begins of actually trying to turn this gathering of the clans into an army. They have immediate logistical problems. They've got some of the guns that they've taken off the Doutai, but they haven't got the transports to move them, so those guns have to be buried, which is perhaps not an auspicious start to a military campaign. But nevertheless, by the end of the 19th of August, Charles Edward Stuart has got an army of sorts, a clan army, most of whom are Gaelic-speaking Highlanders, pretty motivated. He's the guys that come out first are the guys that are going to be the most committed. So he has an army, and he's very fortunate because of the international situation that the British military resources in Scotland are relatively thin on the ground, and so he's got a little bit of space to manoeuvre with it. But it's that moment, that sort of iconic moment in Scottish history that it's now become, when the standard is raised at Glenfinnan, the 1745 rising has begun.
That's awesome. And is there any sort of like commemoration for that today, or is this kind of just, do modern Scots go and drink brandy and look over the landscape and think what might have been?
Well, it's a very famous spot. There is a monument, early 19th century monument to the raising of the standard, which is a hugely popular visitor attraction. The statue at the top of it is sometimes mistaken for being Charles Edward, but it isn't. It's supposed to be a sort of generic clansman or clan chief. So it's a memorial to the raising of the standard and to the clans that rose for him. But it's a beautiful, iconic spot, and a National Trust for Scotland visitor centre attached to it, as you would expect. With car parks and cafes. But they annually, on the nearest weekend to the 19th, the Glenfinnan Highland Games take place just adjacent to the monument. So you still see a gathering of the clans every year at that historic spot. It's been depicted in artworks and embroideries and paintings. It is one of those famous spots. And there's still a lot of debate over exactly where the standard itself was raised, and some hot debate over exactly which rock on which knoll was the exact spot. It's an iconic moment because it's the beginning of what has become this iconic and heavily romanticised part of Scotland's history.
That's awesome. All right, I think at this point we're going to end our part one, and there will be more, like Andrew said, and we'll move into our Murmurs of the Camp section of this episode. And Arran, I'm sure that even though this was a whole lot of information, I'm sure we're just kind of scratching at the surface. Where would you recommend people and listeners go if they're interested and want more information? Is there any good reading? Obviously, Outlander we talked about as being an enormously helpful resource.
You might as well start with Walter Scott if you're going to start with Outlander. The reality is the story of the 45 there's a huge literature for it. It is also a huge variation in quality, and of course the fashions have changed over the years as well. For 40 years ago, 50 years ago or more, people would all have been reading John Preble, but please don't. So there's a huge amount. There's lots of introductory histories to it. anybody who wants to read about the 45, I send them first to Christopher Duffy and to his The 45 or The Fight for the Throne as the sort of revised edition that Helion did later, because that's very comprehensive and insightful and covers the whole campaign, its background and the context before and after the war as well. So you can't do much better than starting there. But it's a big, thick, heavy read, so you'll enjoy it. But yeah, there's lots of, we touched on earlier sort of the different sides of and presentations of Charles Edward. There's a wide biography there. If I were to pick one or two, then I'd be picking sides. So I won't. You should just read mine instead.
There you go. I like it. Good plug.
No, and one which I'd second, having read and reviewed it. I would say, Arran does make the fair point. The Duffy book, while excellent, is also useful for getting things down off high shelves. The other one I'd always say is a go-to. I don't know what your thoughts on this one are, but the Stuart Reed military history as a more accessible and slimmer volume. It seems a fairly solid one to me, but
yeah, no, absolutely agree with that. There are individual breakdowns of the main engagements as well, but no, that's a good, as you say, sort of accessible and relatively slim summary of the whole campaign.
That's it for this episode of Prime and Load. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Don't forget to sign up for our free newsletter with the link in the description. It's the best way to stay up to date with the show, see what's coming up next, and ask us questions. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. This episode was hosted by Drs. Alexander Burns and Andrew Bamford. It was produced by Lee Gugino. Music by Brianna Tam, Ardi Son, and Adrian Beringer. Prime and Load is a Historic Studios podcast.